This week we are going to discuss the New Era. So this is the 1920s. It's also referred to as the Roaring Twenties. And one of the slogans for this period was a return to normalcy. So we get the idea of a return to normalcy from Warren G. Harding. Warren G. Harding was one of the Republican candidates for the election of 1920. So he said, "Let us stop to consider that tranquility at home is more precious than peace abroad, and that both our good fortune and our eminence are dependent on the normal forward stride of all the American people. We want to go on, secure and unafraid, holding fast to the American inheritance and confident of the supreme American fulfillment." So remember that we're just getting out of World War I, and so he wants us to start focusing on what's going on in America, what is making sure that we have peace and tranquility at home. So you phrase this as a return to normalcy. Okay, so here's the election results of 1920. We have Harding versus Cox. So in this election, we had a lot of Republican candidates, but not very many good Democratic candidates. And part of this is because Americans were kind of not really excited about the Democratic Party after having 2 terms of a Democratic president, Woodrow Wilson. So we see them kind of looking for something new. So Harding has a very large victory over Cox, and he is able to win the election with 404 votes to Cox's 127. So in the 1920 election, some of the issues that they were going over was prohibition and the women's suffrage movement. Okay, so here we have the National Women's Party. So the National Women's Party was an American women's political organization which was formed in 1916 with the sole goal of fighting for women's suffrage. So after achieving that goal with the 1920 adoption of the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution, the National Women's Party started to advocate for other issues, including the Equal Rights Amendment, which we'll look more at the Equal Rights Amendment in a later lecture. So with the election in 1920 and Harding becoming president, we have a new First Lady Florence Harding. So Florence Harding was born in 1860. She believed firmly in the necessity of physical exercise for women, and so she often hosted a women's tennis exhibition game on the White House courts. So Florence Harding also shared a vision for a community of women who could work together under the guidance of other women. She supported prison reform movements, which grew from harsh experiences of women suffragists in prison. She was also radical in her public support for the National Society for the Humane Regulation of Vivisection and the National League to Conserve Food Animals. So she was a humanitarian, and she was very involved in animal rights. So Harding's presidency there was a lot of scandal going on during that time, and the biggest one was the Teapot Dome scandal.
Warren G. Harding's presidency was plagued with a series of scandals. What were some of these scandals? Did Harding know about them? From the earliest days of his administration, Warren G. Harding was no stranger to scandal. There were many rumors circulating that Harding had engaged in multiple adulterous relationships with no less than 4 different women. One rumor even claimed that he had fathered a child with one of these women. However, most of the scandals involving the Harding administration did not involve Harding himself, but others in his administration. Harding appointed several of his longtime political supporters to key government positions. These were posts that allowed these men to control, manipulate, and pilfer large sums of government money and resources. This group of men became known as the Ohio Gang because of their close ties to that state. The most notable scandal associated with the Harding presidency has become known as the Teapot Dome scandal. Teapot Dome was a rock formation in Wyoming. Under this rock formation was the U.S. Navy's petroleum reserves. In 1922, Secretary of the Interior Albert Fall leased the rights to produce oil on this land, as well as 2 other locations in California, to the Sinclair Oil Corporation and the Pan American Petroleum and Transport Company. He made this decision without allowing other companies to competitively bid for the contracts. This was legal at the time, but seen as unethical. As the U.S. Senate investigated the scandal, it was discovered that Fall had also become instantly wealthy following the lease agreement. It was eventually revealed that Fall had accepted bribes from the 2 companies in exchange for the production rights. Fall was jailed for 1 year, becoming the first presidential cabinet member to be sentenced to prison due to misconduct in office. Teapot Dome was not the only scandal associated with the Harding administration. The Attorney General, Harry Doherty, and his personal aide, Jess W. Smith, were embroiled in their own scandal. Pharmacies were legally allowed to buy and sell alcohol if they acquired the appropriate permits from the government. It was discovered that Smith was selling these permits illegally to bootleggers who were purchasing and selling alcohol under the guise of owning a pharmacy. Smith was reaping large profits from these illegal permits. The director of the Veterans Bureau, Charles Forbes, was also accused of wrongdoing. Forbes was responsible for overseeing the construction of veterans hospitals all across the country. These contracts were worth millions of dollars to the construction companies they were awarded to. Forbes accepted large bribes from corrupt construction companies who also treated him to wild parties and illegal liquor as he toured the nation at the taxpayers' expense. At least 3 others that Harding appointed to government positions were discovered to be taking bribes. These scandals forever tainted the Harding administration, and to this day, it is remembered as one of the most corrupt presidential administrations in history.
Okay, so there was, as you just saw, there was a lot of scandal during the Harding administration. So Harding wouldn't make it his full term. He would pass away in 1923 of a heart problem. It was most likely a heart attack. Okay, so that means that his vice president at the time, Calvin Coolidge, would take over until the election of 1924. So at the election of 1924, Coolidge decides to run on his own, and he's able to get elected in his own right. Okay, we see that he takes pretty much all of the states besides the South. And we also see that Wisconsin was taken by the Progressive Party candidate, which is really interesting that a third-party candidate was able to win an entire state. So a problem that was addressed in the 1924 election cycle was this issue of corruption, which makes sense because of all of the scandals that had happened in the Harding administration. And so Calvin Coolidge was generally known for his pretty chill personality. He was often called Cool Cal.
Calvin Coolidge became the 30th U.S. president when Warren Harding died of a sudden cerebral hemorrhage in 1923. Vice President Coolidge was sworn in at 2 a.m. in the morning at his house in Vermont. He promptly went back to bed. Unlike Harding, the American public liked Coolidge, despite his reputation for being terse and stiff, which had earned him the nickname Silent Cal. According to legend, a woman once approached him at a party and said, "I made a bet today that I could get more than 2 words out of you." His response? "You lose." Despite this, Silent Cal's presidential speeches were heard by nearly all Americans, as they were the first to be broadcast over the radio. And Coolidge is viewed as a precursor to Ronald Reagan by many historians, and in fact, Reagan himself. He favored small government and laissez-faire economics, and he is known for cutting taxes and ending regulations across various industries. His second term coincided with the Roaring Twenties, a period of rapid economic growth and aggressive use of the Charleston. However, Coolidge decided not to run for a third term in 1928, managing to escape the Oval Office before the reality of Coolidgenomics set in 1929.
Getting elected president is an expensive business.
Okay, so Calvin Coolidge, once again, ran on his own 1924 election, was able to win, and then he decided not to run in the 1928 election, which would turn out to be a pretty good move because shortly after that, we would get the Great Depression. Okay, so like I mentioned last week, this era of the 1920s was known as the culture of consumption. So change is in the very air Americans breathe, and consumer changes are the very bricks out of which we are building our new kind of civilization. So here we see an uptick in people starting to buy goods, specifically goods for their homes, like washing machines, refrigerators, things like that. Okay, we also see the creation of the assembly line with Henry Ford and his creation of cars.
100 years ago, on October 1913, Henry Ford introduced one of history's great inventions, the assembly line. It transformed industry worldwide.
And the mass-produced Model T helped create the American middle class. Dean Reynolds went to Ford's original plant in Detroit to learn more.
The assembly line has always been an impressive mix of man and machine. What it looks like now is a far cry from a century ago when Henry Ford first embraced the idea, one that wound up turning America into an industrial powerhouse with a thriving middle class. Bill Ford is executive chairman of Ford Motor Company and the great-grandson of Henry.
Well, he had visited the meatpacking business in Illinois, and he saw there that the people were stationary and the product was moved to them. And he thought, well, why can't I apply that same principle to the car industry? So that's really where he got the innovation for it.
Until Ford's stroke of genius, his automobiles were basically custom-made trophies for the wealthy. That changed.
The assembly line did two things. One is it gave mobility to the average American, and the other is the employment in the plants helped create the middle class.
The process itself has aged well and continues to improve.
To build a quality car, you have to be able to have your operator be able to do it efficiently and to do it injury-free.
Allison Stevens is a technical specialist at Ford's ergonomic lab.
And you now are seeing 3D, and you are inside the computer looking at the design of one of our vehicles.
She showed us how, with 3D animation, she and her team can approximate an assembly line in the quiet of their office, testing parts and designs without the need to build an actual model.
You're seeing every fastener, every hole, every bend in the metal.
This virtual trial and error can tell Ford whether bolts turn, tires fit, or antennas are within reach to maximize efficiency up and down the actual line. Bill Ford likes that kind of thinking.
The assembly line's changed a lot in 100 years. It's still an assembly line, and that to me is really remarkable.
The proof of that can be seen in car after car after car. For CBS This Morning Saturday, Dean Reynolds, Detroit.
It's remarkable how much has changed, but how little has changed in a lot of ways, you know?
I was thinking the exact same thing.
And Dean Reynolds looks stunning in that outfit, doesn't he?
So with the assembly line, we have products being made faster, and it's becoming less expensive to make them. So because this is the culture of consumption, advertisements are becoming very important to show people what they should be buying. Okay, so we see that a lot of times the advertisements are very female oriented, and that is because people who are creating the advertisements for these companies were very aware that women were the ones who primarily did the regular shopping for families. So we see with Orange Crush, with the soda, and with mayonnaise, prominently there are females who are in the advertisements. Okay, same thing with the cigarettes and this beer. Okay, they generally advertise towards women. Okay, so escapism and entertainment. So this was definitely the generation of entertainment, or the decade of entertainment. So like we saw with the assembly line, we now have automobiles which are being mass produced. Because of the assembly line, they are being produced for cheaper, so they become more affordable. And automobiles are now used to travel pretty much wherever people want to go. Before this, they would either have to, like ride on a horse or go on like railroads, but now it becomes a lot easier for people to like take a weekend trip somewhere, and it becomes a lot more convenient to travel. Okay. So movies. So the one on the right, the Ten Commandments, it's just going over the 10 Commandments that we see in the Bible. But the jazz singer, so in this movie, there's the main actor really likes jazz and likes ragtime, wants to be a performer, but his father is against his son doing that and wants him to carry on his family tradition. So the main actor, Jakey, tries his hand anyways, and only to be discovered by his neighbor, and then he is eventually kicked out of the house. So a decade later, he decides to still follow his dream. He's changed his name, and he has fell in love with a fellow performer, but he still wants to win his father over. So just showing how prevalent things like jazz and ragtime are starting to become in American society. Okay, so with the popularity of movies, we now have actresses that are starting to become really well known. So we have Mary Pickford. She was born in 1892, was actually born in Canada, but she was considered America's sweetheart. So in her late teens and early 20s, she was often portrayed as a teenager, someone around the age 14 or 15. She often had roles where she portrayed someone who was very young and innocent and sweet. Okay. Then we have Dolores Del Rio. So she was a very important actress of this time. So she was a Mexican actress, dancer, and singer, and she is often regarded as the first major female Latin American crossover star in Hollywood. So we get radio and the jazz age. So across the nation, Americans started to use their radios to listen to national broadcasts of a trial that dealt with questions of religious liberty, academic freedom, parental rights, and the moral responsibility of education. So the radio here is pretty much becomes commonplace in American households. It's basically what the TV is today. So it's how people became informed on current issues, how they were aware of what things were going on. They could also listen to sports broadcasts, things like that. And we also see the jazz age come into play, where people start to play different jazz instruments, and then jazz music is often played at clubs a lot, where people would go dancing. So another form of entertainment during this time was sports, and we start to see the rise of women being involved in sports. So we have the first woman, which is Hazel Hotchkiss Whiteman. She was important because she was an American tennis player, and she was the founder of the Whiteman Cup, and this was an annual team competition for British and American women. She also dominated American women's tennis before World War I and won 45 U.S. titles during her life, which is pretty impressive that she was able to play tennis effectively when she had to wear a dress while she was playing. So then the woman on the right, she was an American competition swimmer. She was a 3-time Olympic gold medalist and former world record holder in multiple swimming events. Then we have Bessie Coleman. So she was an early American aviator. She was the first African American woman and first Native American to hold a pilot license. So she earned her license from an institution in France on June 15, 1921, and she was the first Black person to earn an international pilot's license. Okay, so this era is generally known as the era of the new women because women are starting to have more rights. They're starting to kind of go outside of the workforce, and we see that from World War I. They're starting to dress differently. They now have the right to vote. So there's a lot of changes going on in the role of women. So the Chicago Tribune said that today's woman gets what she wants: the vote, slim sheaths of silk to replace voluminous petticoats, glassware in sapphire blue or glowing ember, the right to a career, soap to match her bathroom's color scheme. So this is kind of interesting because it's kind of putting side by side some very important things that women are now able to do, like voting, and they can have a career now, with some of the more frivolous things that are often associated with women, like having clothes and having jewelry and making sure their houses are decorated appropriately. So part of this new woman is this idea of the flapper. So characteristics of the flapper normally have she has bobbed hair, short skirts, makeup, smoking a cigarette, and has this carefree spirit or attitude. Another reason why this was considered the new woman was because women could finally exercise their right to vote, which before they hadn't been able to do. Also, we have increased opportunities for women to work outside of the home. And we have this because women were starting to work outside the home more during World War I, while a lot of young men were fighting in the war in Europe. Okay, so here's an example of what dancing looked like, and we see a dance that a lot of flappers would do. Okay, so obviously dancing in the 1920s is a little bit different from dancing that we're more familiar with today. Okay, so now we are going to take a look at the religious aspect of the 1920s. So here we have the rise of fundamentalist Christianity, and this comes from A.C. Dixon with his writing, The Fundamentals. So fundamental Christianity was just a new kind of sect of Christianity where they were very much concerned about how relaxed people were becoming in the 1920s, and the increased social freedoms, especially as found in more populated places, like in larger cities like Chicago, New York, places like that. So they were starting to become more concerned because they felt like Christian morals, which they believed were prevalent in America, were starting to kind of degrade and be forgotten about. Okay, so we see this fundamental Christianity, we see this in what is known as the trial of the century with the Scopes trial.
John Scopes, a young teacher of Tennessee, had taught, contrary to state law, Darwin's theory of evolution. The Tennessee country people believed this was contrary to biblical doctrine. And Scopes' trial got worldwide publicity, with the Tennessee fundamentalists lined up against the liberals and intellectuals of America. William Jennings Bryan, old and full of oratory, defended the beliefs of the fundamentalists. He was aided by the prosecuting zeal of old Judge Ben McKenzie, a local politician influential in the area, who helped to make the trial an inquisition. The courtroom was packed as the case reached a climax. Arthur Garfield Hayes, defending Scopes, explained Darwin's theory of evolution, and Dudley Field Malone, another liberal, added his plea for tolerance to the cause of freedom of thought. Then the defense threw in another artful veteran, Clarence Darrow, for what turned out to be the cross-examination of Bryan. Darrow, in a shirt-sleeves analysis, reduced the elder statesman's antiquated ideas to intellectual rubble.
After the closing remarks, Judge Ralston charged the jury, and they retired for their deliberations on a verdict. On the day of the announced decision, the two opposing sides waited calmly in the courtroom. The jury foreman, Captain Jack Thompson, delivered the verdict of guilty as charged. John Scopes received the decree of his $100 fine without any outward show of bitterness. 2 years later, the decision was to be reversed in the Appellate Court of Appeals. William Jennings Bryan died 5 days after the end of the famous trial. Although victorious in the courtroom, he and the fundamentalist cause had been destroyed. The encounter in Dayton, Tennessee, had solved the basic struggle of thinking and education in the modern-day world.
Okay, so with the Scopes trial, we see John Scopes, who was a high school biology teacher, is found guilty of teaching evolution in schools. Okay, so we also have this culture war. So we have two acts which are passed, the Emergency Immigration Act of 1921. So this established the nation's first numerical limits on the number of immigrants who could enter the United States. So before this, we would have a lot of immigrants coming into the United States, but we didn't limit the number of immigrants, but now they did in 1921. Then they followed that up with the National Origins Act of 1924, and this prevented immigration from Asia and set quotas on the number of immigrants from the Eastern Hemisphere. So it's kind of just a more specific form of the Emergency Immigration Act of 1921. Okay, so part of this culture war, we have these two men, and Sacco and Vanzetti, and they are involved in this because in On April 15th, 1920, a paymaster for a shoe company in South Braintree, Massachusetts was shot and killed along with his guard. So there were witnesses that at the time believed that these two men had committed the crime. Despite worldwide demonstrations in support of their innocence, they were both executed for murder. And so some people think that they were just convicted because they were Italian. So Vanzetti said, "This is what I say. I am suffering because I am a radical. And indeed I am a radical. I have suffered because I was an Italian. And indeed I am an Italian." So people believe that part of the reason why they were convicted was because of where they were from and the fact that they were immigrants. Okay, so during this period, we also have what was termed the New Negro. Okay, so it's evident in the Harlem Renaissance.
The Harlem Renaissance is one of the most iconic cultural periods in African American history. Throughout the decade of the 1920s, Black writing, art, and music flourished, ushering in a cultural revolution that rocked the United States.
One of the most important factors that accounted for the rise of what we know of as the Harlem Renaissance is the migration of Black peoples from the South to urban centers like Harlem.
The Jim Crow era began after Reconstruction, and every Southern African American had to think about, what should we do? Should we go or should we stay? For many of these people, it was a matter of life and death, literally.
Sometimes in the most repressive times, we create the most extraordinary art.
Amidst the fervor of the Great Migration, bold, exciting forms of Black music evolved, along with venues to listen and dance to this music. Blues and jazz clubs became a central part of life in Harlem, where artists such as Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington, Bessie and Mamie Smith rose to prominence.
Began to cry. He went away and never even said goodbye.
The era also saw the burgeoning of literary work by and about African Americans, which the writer Alain Locke compiled into an anthology. He called it The New Negro, and its name came to define a movement.
The Harlem Renaissance is a facet of a larger movement that we think of as the New Negro movement, where you have a new generation of Black people, by this point, 2 generations out of slavery, using the arts as a way to help people gain broader civil and political rights.
Some of the framers of what became the Renaissance make the argument that the artistic worth of a people has to be proven by the worth of the art and literature they produced, especially for people that historically, over centuries, have been defined as without culture, without history, and without any record of achievement.
The Harlem Renaissance was the flowering of creativity that had been suppressed for centuries. People that had the sense that things were opening up. And finally, we could be the people that we imagine ourselves to be.
So as we see with this era, there becomes a lot of creativity coming out of or from African Americans, whether that be through music or whether that be through writing. Okay, but there's also racial violence that is happening at the same time.
On June 1st, 1921, 9-year-old Eldoris Makondichi was awakened by her mother. What her mother said next, she never forgot.
She says, we have to go out, get out. She says, the white people are killing the colored people.
Eldoris grew up in the Greenwood area of Tulsa, a buoyant, bustling community of some 10,000 African Americans. There were schools, churches, stores, theaters, and a hospital.
It was a place where, for African Americans, the American dream was working.
Scott Ellsworth is a Tulsa native. He's been searching for the truth of what happened here most of his life, reporting his findings in a new book, The Groundbreaking.
Something happens in an elevator in an office building in downtown Tulsa between a 19-year-old shoe shiner who's African-American named Dick Rowland and a 17-year-old white elevator operator named Sarah Page.
A scream from Page leads to Rowland's arrest the next day. By that evening, a lynch mob gathered outside the courthouse where Rowland was jailed.
The hours go by. The lynch mob is 100, 200, 500, 800 people going.
Word gets to Greenwood, and a group of Black World War I veterans show up to help the sheriff defend Rowland. They're turned away.
As they are leaving, an elderly white man went up to a tall black vet and said, "Where are you going with that gun?" A tussle ensues, a shot goes off, and the massacre begins.
The veterans retreat to Greenwood with the mob in pursuit. Gun battles erupt, but somehow it is quiet overnight until the next morning.
All of a sudden, there's a whistle that goes off, and at that point, this white mob starts walking towards Greenwood.
Eldoris and her family flee, running north up a set of railroad tracks.
The crowd was just the whole breadth of the railroad track, on the sides and down the middle.
The residents of Greenwood try to defend their neighborhood, but they don't have a chance. The National Guard sprays the residents with machine gun fire, and it gets worse.
You have something new up in the air, and its airplanes start flying over Greenwood. There is evidence, and I believe this firmly, that at least on one of the airplanes, a co-pilot is dropping sticks of dynamite down on Greenwood.
The airplanes was up, just raining down the bullets, and I could see them, and I heard them, and I was so frightened.
Greenwood is left a smoldering ruin. 9,000 people left homeless. The dead uncounted. Estimates range from 75 to 300. Eldoris lived until 2010. Her granddaughter, Joy McConaughey, keeps her story alive. What did Tulsa lose by having that entire neighborhood destroyed?
The glory of the bright city shining on the hill.
Eldoris and other survivors gave testimony to the Tulsa Race Riot Commission, a commission that ultimately recommended reparations for the survivors.
The state had a great opportunity and they turned it down. Instead, they gave each survivor a gold-plated medal.
A sorry substitute for the enormous loss.
Why should the sins of the father be visited upon the son?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'll tell you why, because the wealth of the father went along with the sins of the father, and that wealth was visited upon the son.
A lingering question is where the victims were buried. The commission identified 3 potential mass grave sites. One has yielded a dozen caskets, but there's another site, never filmed before, that has Scott's attention, near a homeless encampment above the Arkansas River.
In 2002, a retired Tulsa police officer named Bob Patty told us about being shown a photograph showing a trench with bodies in it. You could see a steam shovel behind it. So it's our supposition that it's here. And the homeless are very much convinced that there is something evil in the canes right there.
Kevin Ross is chairman of the Mass Graves Investigation.
Do you feel like Tulsa has come to grips with this very dark day 100 years ago?
I wouldn't say grip. I think Tulsa has come to make that first step.
Joy McConaughey will be taking her own steps to come to terms with the past, organizing a century walk for June 1st, retracing the same route her grandmother took some 100 years ago.
We're going to walk a mile in their shoes as they escaped on this Midland Valley Railroad track. That's the only way I think I can make my grandmother proud.
Those thousands that escaped off those railroad tracks were then put in the equivalent of internment camps for some time before they were let go again.
Please, go ahead. There's a million questions. I have a million answers.
What about the people there now, Harry? I mean, I know in
There's
the
a
years
tiny little piece of that neighborhood left, a block and a half maybe, on two sides of the street. And the other side was almost all flattened, right? There's a giant branch campus of Oklahoma State University there, right? And otherwise a lot of open territory. It's, there's so many sins, right, that we have committed as white Americans against our black brethren. But as they go, this is as bad as it gets.
Well, and it's multi-generational impact.
Right.
It just goes on and on. When you talk about a neighborhood that had so much just promise for her to say that was the shining city on the hill, and to have it be destroyed and what that has wrought over the generations.
I know so many white Oklahomans who, of my age and even a couple of decades younger, said we never heard about
Never
this.
heard about it.
Never knew about
And the reparations question is so disheartening. I mean, there was a chance to try to make things a little bit right, and you get a medal.
Tiny handful of survivors, right? Yeah. Here's your medal.
Yeah. All right.
Harry, thank you.
NBC News Now has a documentary, and there's a lot of documentaries that are out now.
Okay.
We invite you to go out there, take a look, learn what you need to learn.
And the documentary that Harry just mentioned on the Tulsa Massacre, it's called Blood on the Black Wall Street. Tremaine Lima, good friend and colleague, spent a lot of time on that, but it's going to stream tomorrow on NBCNews.com and NBC News Now. It's going to be available on demand starting Sunday on Peacock as we remember what happened in Tulsa 100 years ago.
Thanks for helping us do that, Harry.
We have Marcus Garvey. So he was important because he was a Jamaican publisher and labor organizer. And he built the largest black nationalist organization in the world called the Universal Negro Improvement Association, also known as UNIA. So what Garvey sought to do was to promote racial pride in African Americans, encourage black economic independence, and root out racial oppression in Africa. So Garvey was angered by his aggressive attacks on other black activists and his radical ideas of racial independence. Many African Americans and Afro-Caribbean leaders worked with government officials and launched the Garvey Must Go campaign. So people were kind of upset with the way that he was going about doing this because he was being too aggressive. So a lot of people, or specifically African Americans, they decided that he needed to stop what he was doing because he was causing more harm than good. Okay, so here we see the followers of Garvey, known as Garveyites, in uniform. Okay, so lastly, we are going to look at the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan, also known as the KKK. So the KKK was a white supremacist organization that expanded beyond the Reconstruction era, so the era following the Civil War. They were known for their anti-black politics, and they claimed to protect American values and the American way of life from black people, feminists, immigrants, Catholic Jews, atheists, bootleggers, and a lot of other moral enemies. So originally, they came to existence after the Civil War during the Reconstruction period, but then they kind of died down. Then we see a resurgence of them in the rebirth of the KKK during the 1920s. Although this chapter of the KKK would not last very long. So why do we have the rebirth of the KKK? One of the major reasons is because of this film on the left, which is The Birth of a Nation. So this is a popular and groundbreaking film, and it showed that it valorized the Reconstruction era Klan, and it showed them as protectors of feminine virtue and white racial purity. So it's kind of just instilling and bringing back these ideas of white supremacy and how important that is and how they were actually protectors of women, which justified their actions. Okay, then we see Leo Frank, who is on the right. So he was an American factory superintendent who was convicted in 1913 for the murder of a 13-year-old employee in Atlanta, Georgia. His trial, conviction, and appeals attracted national attention, and he was eventually lynched 2 years afterward in response to his death sentence being commuted. And he became the focus of social, regional, political, and racial concerns, particularly regarding anti-Semitism. So another reason why the KKK was reborn was because of these anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish feelings that were being evoked by the case of Leo Frank. So at the end of the 1920s, even as the new culture of consumption promoted new freedoms, it also promoted new insecurities. So there were a lot of problems that weren't necessarily being addressed. So there were flailing European economies, high tariffs, wealth inequality, a construction bubble. There was a flooded consumer market because, as we saw, there were a lot of things that were starting to be produced in terms of entertainment, like cars, radios, refrigerators, all things like that. Which all of these things would eventually bring the Roaring Twenties to a halt. So for farmers, racial minorities, unionized workers, and other populations that did not share in the 1920s prosperity, the idea of the Jazz Age and a booming economy had always been a fiction. So generally, we look at the 1920s as an era of prosperity and things going fairly well in America, but that is or was not the case for minorities and for the lower class.